Colleagues, good morning. Welcome to our opening ceremony. And I'd like to invite you to all please stand for the arrival of His Excellency Rear Admiral Kevin Scarce, Governor of South Australia. Colleagues, please be seated. Well, good morning. I'm Julianne Moss. I'm the current president of the Australian Association of Research in Education, and my term is from 2013 to 2014. It's my pleasure this morning to welcome our distinguished guests, Rear Admiral Kevin Scarce, the Governor of South Australia, Professor Michael Peters, Professor Peter Buckskin and Professor Jill Blackmore, who will be delivering our 2013 Radford Address. I'd like to acknowledge the Chair of the Conference Standing Committee, Julie White, who has brought together this major event for AARE. We have 630 delegates from 23 countries present, and let's not forget the 550 followers who are on Twitter. So before we begin our opening ceremony, we would like to acknowledge that this land that we meet on today is the traditional land for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge that the Kaurna people, as the custodians of the Adelaide region and their cultural heritage beliefs, are still important to us, to the living Kaurna people today. I would now like to invite His Excellency Rear Admiral Kevin Scarce, the Governor of South Australia, to give us the opening address.
Thanks, Julia. On behalf of all South Australians, can I welcome all the delegates to the conference this morning, and in particular Associate Professor Julianne Moss, the President of the Australian Association of Research and Education, Dr. Julie White, the Conference Chair. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to deliver the opening address for the 2013 Annual International Conference of the Australian Association of Research and Education. The theme of this conference is Shaping Australian Education Research, a theme that emphasises how education research is moulded by our history, our geography and our culture. It reinforces the importance of using research to inform the everyday practices, policies and education approaches that impact upon all Australians. The conference is designed to give education researchers and educators an opportunity to share local, national, global perspectives on education research. I think it's appropriate that a conference about education research takes place in Adelaide, as South Australia has 4 major universities and many other educational institutions of note. All of them take pride in delivering a world-class educational experience. And I see from your program that you've got 3 eminent keynote speakers: Professor Jill Blackmore from Deakin University, Professor Peter Buckskin from the University of South Australia, and Professor Michael Peters from the University of Waikato. I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing from each of these 3 speakers, who will bring a wide range of expertise to the field of educational research. And I also welcome those delegates who are attending from across Australia, from the Asia Pacific and from around the world. I offer you a warm welcome, and I trust that you enjoy your visit to Adelaide. You may have heard that there's a test match at the revamped Adelaide Oval this week. I certainly hope that doesn't affect the conference attendance. However, if cricket is not your thing, I'm sure you would have heard about our wonderful wine and food, and I trust you have an opportunity to get out and enjoy it. Research and education is an important area that impacts and improves learning across Australia and indeed the world. There are many challenges for this field of research, ranging from social, economic, political, and of course the issues of workforce planning. The association works to mitigate and address these challenges. Thus, the central purpose of the association is to support the development of high-quality educational research in Australia and overseas. This annual conference is the major forum for both achieving and celebrating the objective. It brings together researchers, both those experienced in the field and those just starting, to share knowledge, skill and expertise. One of the challenges facing research and education is that of an ageing gender-dominated workforce. Figures show that about 2/3 of researchers in Australian universities are female, and more than 2/3, about 68%, are aged between 45 and 65 years of age. It's worth highlighting that only a small proportion of researchers, about 6.5%, are under the age of 35. As early career researchers and research students are the future of the discipline, it's vital that they're supported through their early work. The Australian community as a whole needs to learn more about why educational research matters. The association believes education research brings a vital contribution to the social and economic future of Australia and our place in a rapidly evolving world. For small economies such as Australia, education will be the key to develop the comparative advantage needed to successfully compete in the global economy. So I don't think there's a more important time in this nation's history for us to ensure that we further promote evidence-based inquiry into educational research. We simply can't afford to tinker with a national education system. For example, when I see MOOCs being hailed as the biggest revolution in education in the past 100 years, I wonder whether that mode of delivery is being afforded the rigorous and systematic evaluation necessary before being widely adopted through Australia and indeed the world. I certainly trust this is one of the subjects for your conference this week. I'd like to conclude by extending my best wishes for the next few days. I'm sure that you'll have an effective and beneficial exchange of ideas, and I'm pleased to declare this year's 2013 Australian Association of Research in Education Conference open. Thank you.
Thank you, His Excellency, and on behalf of the Executive and the membership, we appreciate your attendance at this conference. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gavin.
We now turn to our first keynote address. And as you will have noticed in our program, it's going to be delivered by Michael Peters. Michael is well known to many of us, but given that we've got some 200 first-time attendees at this conference, perhaps not everybody knows Michael's scholarship. He's currently Professor of Education at Waikato University. He's Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Adjunct Professor in the School of Art at RMIT, which is in Melbourne, Australia, and Guangzhou University. What does that tell us about Michael and his scholarship? We're delighted that he's here to be with us for this week. He is certainly a scholar of eminence. Michael, thank you for accepting our invitation, and I invite you to deliver our first keynote address for the 2013 annual conference.
I noticed the Governor has left at this point, and I was about to say something about MOOCs. Kia ora tātou. Excellent, Your Excellency Rear Admiral Kevin Scarce, Julianne Moss, President WARE, Julie White, Chair of the Conference's Standing Committee, members of the Organising Committee, and WARE colleagues. Let me start by also expressing an acknowledgement for the Kaurna people, Indigenous people of the Greater Adelaide Plains, a territory that extends from Cape Jervis to Port Broughton. I stand in solidarity with them and wish them a speedy resolution of their native land title claims. I would also like to express my thanks to the WARE Executive Conference organisers for inviting me to speak at this year's annual conference. WARE is an august institution, and one that increasingly exercises a great deal of influence over the shape of educational research, not only in Australasia but in the rest of the world. And before coming to this annual meeting, I took the opportunity to read the late Bob Besant and Alison Holbrook's 1995 reflection on educational research in Australia, and researched the establishment of ACER and WARE and its sister organisations in New Zealand. Placing these institutional histories in the context of the birth of educational research, I was struck by how recent, relatively speaking, educational research is, and the ongoing fundamental tensions it exhibits between a test and measurement orientation that grew up with experimental psychology and what I will call theories of educational practice, dating perhaps from the pragmatists William James and John Dewey. The first annual research meeting took place in 1967, and while it's possible to trace the roots to Marc Antonin Julian de Paris's first attempts at comparative education of the early 19th century, to the Manchester Society's surveys of literacy and educational history of working class in the 1830s, and of course the beginnings of experimental psychology, to Binet and Simon in France, Ley and Merman in Germany, Rice, Thorndike and Judd in the US. It's not really until 1930 that ACER is established with funding from the Carnegie Foundation, and WARE is established in 1970. The first year of its foundation conference with a membership of some 150 researchers. I was reminded by Julianne that WARE is older than BERA by some 3 years. The AGE, the Australian Journal of Education, published by ACER, Melbourne Studies in Education were both established in 1957, where the former focused, quote, on mental testing, measurement and curriculum. The latter was more concerned with history, philosophy, management, comparative and politics of education, reflecting perhaps that symbolic split that characterised the birth of educational research between Dewey and Thorndike, a kind of caricature, I guess, between measurement and testing on the one hand and philosophy, history and politics on the other. Well, I'm pleased to say that John Quay and Stephen Stoltz have established an educational philosophy and theory, SIG, that begins this year for the first time. It's great to see philosophy back, and congratulations to those two for establishing that new SIG. The split, I think, has become more pronounced with the development of social and cultural theory in the 1980s. Besant and Holbrook write that of the trend towards sociological, historical, political, and cultural aspects of education, very often based on ethnographic, naturalistic styles of research, eschewing the grand visions of the psychologists. This new emphasis on the social, cultural context of education, on class race, gender, sexual orientation and disability, and later in Indigenous studies, established a new approach and began to transform the different fields of educational psychology itself. Besant and Holbrook do not comment on the birth of social and cultural studies in education, but much of it, I think, can be put down to the recuperation and emphasis on what I would call, after Bourdieu, the logic of practice, which in my view largely is due philosophically to what I call the Dewey-Wittgenstein configuration. And that configuration can be read backwards to include Hegel and Marx. It can be read forwards to understand the practice theory in the work of Heidegger, Bourdieu, Derrida, Foucault, Latour, and others. The contemporary turn to practice, to social and cultural practices, anchors a strong epistemological, ethical, and political reading, and flourished in education in the notion of reflective practitioner, the growth of action research, practitioner cultures per se, situated cognition, communities of practice, and most recently in evidence-based practice. Educational research has also developed these new ethnicity studies, ethnographic methods, and most importantly, Indigenous philosophies and methodologies that highlight notions of self-reflexivity and cultural practice. And in the first decades of the 20th century, the emergence of global systems have transformed education and educational research. In the future, these massive digital global systems will transform research scholarship, periodical book publishing, archive and library science. Many of these developments are at the heart of knowledge capitalism that has spawned not only the giant information multinationals, but also the form of knowledge capitalism based on a kind of cybernetic rationality. The shift in the logic of systems from industrial Taylorist models to digital systems have transformed the market and also democracy. It's created massive open systems that increasingly permit general access through distributed knowledge and learning systems. They've also created new markets in educational technologies that increasingly control and steer state and global education systems. The next advance, so-called data analysis, big data analysis, and learning analytics is touted as the next revolution. And my talk today is oriented to this topic. While I focus on MOOCs as the immediate object of inquiry, my comments apply to the emerging nature of global digital systems in education. I want to highlight this in terms of a new political economy that can grasp so-called ed tech as part of knowledge capitalism. As part of the research agenda, I want to propose openness as a contemporary movement that enhances public institutions, that relies on a theory of social practice, the intellectual commons, and a theory of creative labour rather than human capital theory. So with those introductory remarks, let me now move to a series of slides that I want to show you. That does have a paper that accompanies these slides, and I'm afraid I do play fast and loose with the epistemology of the PowerPoint. It gives you a kind of mystique. It seems to suggest that because you put something in a list, there is some coherence and logic that moves from one to the other, but it may also be just simply the logic of association, the logic of proximity. So let me see how this works. Okay. So the structure of the presentation here, just going back, I use a phrase, the revolution to come, MOOCs and the politics of the post-industrial university. And I use that phrase, the revolution to come, from one document by Sir Michael Barber, who wrote a paper last year that's become very important. Here's the structure of the presentation. Inside the global teaching machine, a history of openness. I raise that as a question. And then I really want to examine more closely the revolution to come. I want to analyse so-called right rhetoric. And then we look at the current initiatives, the main player and business models here, followed by post-industrial university, focusing on the question of pedagogy, the question of the economics of academic labour and monetisation, or we might say financialisation. And finally, I end up on a hopeful note, looking at an education and research agenda which really seeks an alternative vision based on a concept of radical openness. Okay, so inside the global teaching machine, I should ask you, how does it feel? From program instruction to MOOCs. So the elements of the emerging global teaching machine, it really does go back to the 1920s. I think that if you would read some of the philosophers, we would probably look at Leibniz and others during the European Enlightenment. And ed-tech developments to do with the history of the failure of educational technology around public radio and public television. Are we about to see a repetition of that same failure? Some emphasis on personalisation, on the global calibrations to do with standardisation and internationalisation. And finally, MOOCs. Where does open education fit within this touted chronology? So, inside the teaching machine, let's look very quickly at the behaviouristic principles of B.F. Skinner, who looked at a rhythmic pattern, who was really devising a set of program instruction which was in hand with the existing industrial model. He was a psychology of industrial systems. And one sees also, I think, in this chart, the move from correspondence to open education. A movement that starts with correspondence with Sir Isaac Pitman in the 1840s, who used shorthand on postal notes as a means for the first example of distance education. And I think it was 1843. And you see the way in which this movement has moved so quickly through to open source, coming out of open source, open content, open courseware, and finally massive online open courses, the so-called MOOC. Now, I want to raise a question here about whether MOOCs really fits into this history, or whether it appropriates it for other purposes. Let me explain. But before I do, I want to go back to this little article, The Rebirth of the Teaching Machine, because this was written this year. It talks about technology platforms delivering personalised learning to every student. The rebirth of the teaching machine is based on these adaptive learning systems, with grand claims to individualised learning by controlling every facet of learning. Personalised choice with central control and an increasingly data-driven, standardised, mechanised learning system. These really are the elements of design for a global, emerging global teaching machine, learning machine. And I include, there's far too much text here, but I'm going to pick out one or two things here, the way in which we might give a kind of Foucauldian interpretation of technologies of choice, flexibility and individualisation through these global systems. In particular, also the business-like customisation, streamlined workforce productivity, which is touted to be cost-effective, and in particular the way in which this kind of sets up the move towards increasing standardisation, centralisation, and the emergence of big data and personalised learning, which is touted to be the next tsunami. Well, and I think that we need to be aware very much of this movement, this global movement, which I think threatens to obliterate many of the theories we've worked from. And it's quite interesting to see this as the third or fourth phase in terms of a critical history of educational research. I take this from Ryan Baker, who runs the Coursera course on big data and learning analytics. The emerging research communities in educational data mining and learning analytics, he says, are developing methods for mining, modelling, increasing amounts of fine-grained data becoming available to learners. And here are the kinds of topics that we dealt with. My question is, where does this data come from? Does it come with consent? Who controls it? All the traditional questions about political economy. To whose end is it used? To what extent is it used to sell more educational products? I mean, I think we are bound to begin in even a naive way to ask these questions. So, even the Deputy Director and Special Advisor on Education Policy in the OECD is touting the significance of this movement, which he's saying is the foundation of which education can reinvent its business model and build coalition of governments, social entrepreneurs that bring together innovation. So, okay, Andreas, can I say, where does the educational researcher fit in this? Where does the teacher figure in it? Where's the learner, for goodness sake? And we know about big data and the consortia. Where is openness in these algorithmic teaching and learning systems? Openness considered as a form of peer governance, peer learning, information transparency. And I came across this very interesting article by Lindsay Grant, really, who focuses on a potentially lucrative new market tapping into students' data. Well, in view of the NSA scandals here and the privacy breaches, I've got to raise at least a question. And I think this is a good platform to do it. I'm hoping it will. Who decides our learners' identities? Who controls that? And it's a question that I have raised for going back quite a long time. I wrote a book, edited a book with Rodrigo Bretes from Uruguay, now I think the head of research in that country, in a program first developed by Fazil Rizvi at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Great to work with Fazil, a great visionary on these things. I took the opportunity when I developed this course in 2006, after Fazil was largely instrumental in recruiting, Tina and I to University of Illinois in 2006, of mounting this course around educational openness, a course called Open Source, Open Access, Open Education. And this is a comment from Fazil, who goes to the heart of the matter. He talks about neoliberal globalization, you can read it for yourself, the way it is in a acute marriage with new communications technologies, how they're hand in hand, how it's occurred in a space characterized by asymmetrical relations of power. And he asks about that despite, if I can read that last sentence of his here, despite their cosmopolitan promise, new media technologies, so often noted as the key driver of globalization, have produced patterns of cultural and linguistic privileges now at the global level. And he talks about the way in which it has been responsible for uneven social and educational consequences. I think it's a great comment of his here. He wrote the preface here, and I think that was quite good because he summarises much more precisely than I do in the introduction here the way in which the key terms of the course, open source, open access, open education, really begin to work at descriptive, analytical, normative, imaginative levels kind of simultaneously. But I think the point here is that the notion of openness itself became a key term of debate. And I think that question really of openness goes right back a long way in the West to Enlightenment principles and philosophies. Open education, I would maintain, involves a commitment to openness and is therefore inevitably a political and social project, intimately tied to democracy, to freedom of speech, to access to knowledge, access to education, universal general access to education. I'm not saying anything new there. And I think that we might also say that it has occurred in this parallel technological development that has heightened certain political, epistemological features and technologically enabled questions of access to knowledge, co-production, co-design of educational programs and so on. And it sits within a broader framework of the history of openness that brings together a number of fields and disciplines, technologies, that directly impact on the value of knowledge and learning, their geographic distribution, ownership, and their organisation. So that book was actually published in 2008 based on a course at Illinois in 2006. And I tried to theorise the social and collaborative nature, a project that I'm still involved in when I did a keynote back in 2008. This is one example of a number of presentations that I've given around theorising openness with Professor Peter Roberts from Canterbury University in New Zealand, a colleague of long-standing friendship. We did a book actually in 2012 called The Virtues of Openness. And here we were really looking also not only at the ethic of sharing and peer-to-peer collaboration. I mean, after all, if you want to characterise the scientific enterprise, then the question of peer review is pretty fundamental. It's a cornerstone. And I might say, with the Royal Society, beginning in the 17th century, that I have to say this actually for my British colleagues, that it was Edinburgh that first introduces peer review about some 100 years after the founding of the Royal Society. And they did it for legal reasons to prevent the risk and liability with people making false statements. So, I mean, although it kicks in for a range of different political reasons, I think that it becomes the essence of the scientific enterprise. It becomes a basis for peer governance, it becomes a learning system, it becomes the basis for the material reproduction of ideas in the form of journals, the development of what we know as academic journals today. So it's pretty fundamental. And, this notion of peer learning, of flat hierarchies, of user-generated cultures now have come to characterise social media in its relation to education. So this book here really begins to suggest and document political transparency, the norms of open inquiry. That's what I'm talking about. Indeed, even democracy itself is the basis for a logic of inquiry, dissemination of results. And I guess I'm not a fan of Popper. I don't want to go to the Popperian defence of liberal modernity. When he wrote that book and he described it as his war effort, I much prefer the Wittgensteinian reading of openness, and maybe if I get a chance I can talk about that in the question time rather than go into it this moment. But it is a complex question of openness, and my heroes in this history of political openness in the contemporary, on the contemporary stage really begin with Deng Xiaoping in 1992, followed by Gorbachev and the policy of openness, perestroika, a question where he focused his policies on information transparency against the activities of a range of secret organisations that were reporting on people in that space. We might also go to the Arab Spring and the youth in the Arab and Muslim countries who are using the mobile technologies as so-called tools for political coordination here. It's so recent, it's remarkable, and it's very difficult to assess at this moment, but we might see the removal of a number of dictators as also part of this notion of openness, part of the Arab Spring, and we might even talk about the academic spring in relation to mandating open access in relation to research files. So it's a very complex movement, and one that's open to historical interpretation, of course. It's an idea here, the idea of openness. These are works. Anybody wants the slides are most welcome to them. Here are a series of essays that I published in an encyclopedia called the Encyclopedia of Educational Philosophy and Theory, which it's an open online encyclopedia that I established with Paulo Girardelli Jr. Going back in 1999. So I'm really trying to work through this notion in ways that has its own kind of praxis. And recently I worked with a couple of my PhD students in Illinois to write a book on the pedagogy of the open society, really where I begin to look at openness in relation to styles of management in higher education. Very much a let's say counter-management, a counter-narrative to the neoliberal view of line management that doesn't have too much to do with academic culture. Well, unfortunately it does. It provides obstacles and interferes with the academic practices in lots of ways. And I'm beginning now to foreshadow the concept of radical openness here in relation to the possibility of creative institutions, a concept of creative labour in the social media context. Not human capital, creative labour. That's the game. And the logic of public organisations in cognitive capitalism. And here, I guess I'm trying to summarise here how quick these developments are, how interrelated they are, and how much they overlap here, particularly the openness of academic life and the way that it maps itself onto some larger philosophical questions here to do with open government, open management, and open inquiry. Okay, so that's a little bit of background about openness. Now I want to come to try to analyse the revolution to come, the touted revolution to come, by looking at 4 reports. And here's the first. You've probably seen it, and it's been much discussed in Australia. University of the Future, Ernst & Young, that body of great scholarship, all who've done MBAs and business studies, which allows them to comment on the history of the university, if I'm allowed that small irony. University of the Future then, Ernst & Young. In the top right-hand corner there says, over the next 10 to 15 years, the current public university model in Australia will prove unviable in all but a few cases. So I hope you didn't bring a packed lunch. The current Australian model. Here they're saying will prove unviable in all but a few models. I'm sure you all know this. I'm not going to spend a long time on these slides. But here is their analysis. Democratisation of knowledge and access. Okay, I can buy that. Contestability of markets and funding. Well, we know that's a reality. Digital technologies. Okay, we're getting closer to the game here, to the stakes. But also we see there's a kind of interpretation on this kind of, on these movements that provide a kind of irreversible interpretation that leads us straight to the question, really, of privatisation. Global mobility. So, yes, global markets for students, sure. Integration with industry. Well, we knew that would come along the way some time. It'll need significantly deeper relationships with industry in the decade ahead. Little footnote, particularly with Ernst & Young, in relation to some of these consultation reports. We have to recognise the self-serving quality of some remarks here, I should say. And so here are the drivers of change. This is the model. Welcome, Australia, to the world of emerging global systems. Here's another one. Similar rhetoric from the right. An avalanche is coming. A revolution to come, an avalanche is coming. The metaphors trip off the tongue. Higher education, the revolution ahead. Okay, so what do they have to say? Well, Larry Summers writes the foreword for this, this report. He says these are challenges for higher education for the world, not just for the UK and the US. And just as, can I quote Larry Summers here, just as we've seen forces of technology and organisation and globalisation transform sectors such as media and communications or banking and finance over the last 2 decades, these forces now will transform higher education. Welcome to the world of education ATM machines. And on Avalanche, the authors argue that a new phase of competitive intensity is emerging, and the concept of the traditional universe itself comes under pressure. The key word here is unbundled, when the functions of the traditional university can be disaggregated, unbundled, and sold out, outsourced, and sold off. We know the formula. So they hypothesise a variety of different models, including the lifelong learning mechanism, and they look at the fundamental challenges facing all systems around the world. I'm not going to focus too much heavily on these, but really the combination, they say, in the aftermath and the conclusion, the combination of marketisation with the student consumer as king, and globalisation will lead universities being more or less contained within national systems and more both benchmarked globally and leading to the growth of knowledge economics. Well, I mean, I think when we talk about the current reality, we've heard the mantra, globalisation, neoliberalism. We need to significantly add a third term to that group, financialisation. Financialisation. Okay, so here's the New York Times at a conference very recently, Schools for Tomorrow conference on the future of online education. Agenda 1 is online education the great equaliser. Has the university as an institution had its day? Has the traditional university had its day? What happens to university autonomy in these circumstances? What's the new era business model for higher education? Well, in some sense, these are leading questions, we would say, us researchers, I guess, and we know where they're going to end, of course. How will online education revolutionise what we know and understand about learning? Well, that's an interesting question I've got to give. The fourth one, I don't see it as belonging to the group that I've just identified, a white paper by Johan and Powell, delivered in March this year, where they're trying to make sense of MOOCs as one of the key drivers for this process of neoliberalisation, globalisation, financialisation, and its effects on models of higher education. And they use the concept of disruptive innovations to get at this kind of sea change that's occurring. And they provide a scary open education timeline that seems to kick off, after the work that Stephen Downes and others did with connectionist theory of learning in 2008 in Canada. You have a dotted line, admittedly, that provides some kind of historical connection between connectivism, per se, and the Stanford MOOC set up in 2011, and then suddenly the move into 2013 with Udacity, Coursera, MIT's edX, and the recent UK Future Learn consortium called Future Learn was set up a few months ago. Okay, and I'm not going to focus on that timeline. I've really given a bit of an understanding of it. But let's have a look at the current initiatives and just see where it's going, because I think when we get closer to the ground, we understand the current business models. We see here are the business models: edX, non-profit MOOC platform, 20 to 30 courses, set up with an operating venture capital budget of about 60 million. Coursera, a for-profit company, a venture capitalist, 197 courses and 8 subjects, with a total of venture capitalist investment of about 22 million. Udacity, for-profit, 21 million, 18 online courses. Udemy, founded in 2010, 16 million, which allows anyone to teach, participate in online video classes, offering 5,000 courses, with the average price of classes falling between 20 and 200. I've added some of my own here. PDP, launched in 2009, Hewlett Foundation, and Shuttleworth, 50 courses. Khan Academy, that you all know about, I think, with significant backing from the Gates Foundation, offers, 3,600 video lectures, open to study, the MOOC provider in the Australian context. Open up education, 11 universities in the European countries, offering 200 hours of study. Nouveau Ed, developed by Stanford, started up in April 2013. It's I think unusual in the sense that this one is really much more concerned with student integration into interaction. iTunes U offers also a platform, and most recently Future Learn. So here's from the Future Learn UK consortia. We're a private company owned by the Open University, and I think what's interesting here is that really it does begin to make some sense of its history and commitment to distance education. I think one of the few that really begins to focus on the question of pedagogy, which is going to be one of the axes of my inquiries here in Australia and New Zealand. You see the universities that are offering MOOCs here in Australasia. Independent examples: Future Learn, committed to the UK model, Coursera, edX, open to study. MOOCs at Melbourne. So this is taken from the Melbourne University site. I'll let you read that. But it does characterise itself as the first Australian university to join Coursera. And it provides some examples of the courses that they're offering through MOOCs here: macroeconomics, the wealth of nations, optimization, epigenetic control, physiology, climate change, animal behaviour, sexing the canvas, online logic. There's a kind of family resemblance between these topics, I should say. my status as a guest prevents me from making any further comment here. I do want to be able to leave Australia when this conference ends. The California, let me refer to, this is very interesting, I think, the California bill, Senate Bill 520, which was directed to what form of legislating for MOOCs in California. And the senator who put this up was looking at the way in which, at the community college level, there were in excess of some 7,000 students per course, per institution throughout California. Now that's amazing to me, and they saw, the senator, I think with good intentions, saw this as a way of promoting greater access within the University of California system. You see in June of this year, the Online Education Bill 520 passed the Senate. And here is, I've taken a section out of the legislation just to give you a sense of what it says about MOOCs here. It provides students with instructional support, with interaction with instructors. These are all prescriptive elements, if you like. It provides a student with opportunity to assess the extent to which she is suited before enrolling. I think all these are very useful, actually. Includes adaptive learning technology systems, of course, and be made available to students of other systems. Another really kind of interesting piece of the legislation. And this is the way it was reported in the Chronicle of Higher Education March this year. A 9-member faculty council was supposed to oversee the open source textbooks that would come up with the list of 50 lower level courses that students would need to fulfill these requirements. And I'm saying, really, when we look at venture capitalism in relation to MOOCs, the next big deal is the way in which for-profit, not-for-profit consortia involving venture capitalism and universities now shake hands with the providers of digital content, the big publishers, and the providers of video content. We know academic publishing is a massive industry, $80 billion a year. And that's when I studied it, sort of like 4 or 5 years ago. So I think you could probably say, it's grown immensely. But in August we read, MOOC bill dead for now. So this was a requirement for 145 public colleges, and the immediate death of the bill is yet another setback to the wave of private companies hoping to play a role in the public higher education market. Well, why is it dead? Why is it die? Why is it certainly back on the back burner here? Well, just before we come to that question, I wanted to indicate, how big a market EdTech is. And I've focused on one small aspect of it here, learning management systems, market worth nearly $8 billion, forecast recently here, learning management systems, $8 billion, okay. So the opposition to the bill came from the University of California faculty, who really, here's the letter, the petition they put up to the state governor. We write to express our many deep concerns about this bill as recently amended. We believe the bill will lower academic standards, augment educational divide among socio-cultural lines, diminish the ability for underrepresented minorities to excel in higher education. In other words, we predict that the bill would worsen precisely the situation it claims to resolve. Now, 1,600 people signed that petition, and it was instrumental in putting that on the back burner. And one of the interesting things about this is that it does foreshadow the question of academic labour policy. Academic labour policy in relation to MOOCs. But on the other hand, we have Florida saying yes to MOOCs, and Rick Scott signed a bill to expand MOOCs here at the point really when, you know, it's still on the back burner, and who knows how much lobbying and lobbying money will will pass that bill, you know, as it does in the state parliaments in California and also in Washington. I'm not going to talk about that at this moment. But let me move quite quickly here, because I want to leave some time for questions here, the politics of the post-industrial university. And really, in particular, I want to look at the march of the MOOCs. Somebody did a misspelling there of monstrous and massive online courses. The game changes here. And MOOCs is one of the game changers, really, the logic of a move from industrial systems to global digital systems. What is the effect on the global teaching and learning systems here, and the profile that it'll follow? So one of the issues I wanted to focus on here was the academic labour policy, which does raise, I think, some really interesting questions about ourselves in relation to long-term issues of digital or immaterial labour. Automation, de-skilling, deprofessionalisation, precarity for adjuncts, grad assistants and professoriate, ad hoc freelancing work regime. Here are some of the issues involved here. And our good friend Hugh Lauder, working with one of his colleagues here, uses the term digital Taylorism in a different context. I've used this term here. What does digital Taylorism look like in relation to MOOCs, and how does it affect academic labour policy? Well, the labour policy issues here, UCSTA, the president of the 7,000 member faculty of Florida, also warned of a generation of cheap and dirty online courses. And he says no matter how many times they use the word quality, this is a cheapening of what higher education is about. Well, you know, the debate, the rhetoric, the moves are happening very quickly. And while I had a lovely presentation on the birth of educational research, which ran to 516 slides and some 60 papers, I had to jettison it for something that had, I think, more politics in it here and some more immediate effect. We might ask ourselves as well, what happens to pedagogy under digital Taylorism? And I highlight this comment here. Especially disturbing is the fact that none of the major MOOC providers have hired anyone trained in structural design, learning sciences, educational technology, course design. They're hiring a lot of programmers. Well, I don't have anything against programmers, but you know, if we stand for pedagogy and pedagogy of a certain sort, then we have to be wary of that kind of development. And I think pedagogy here also is part of the relationship to cultural difference, the obliteration of cultural difference in global systems, cultural models of globality here between the metropole and the periphery, indigeneity and southern theory that has originated here in Australia. The rise of global studies and global studies in education. I think this is a perfect research platform for them. Okay, so I think the digital Taylorism is expressed in this kind of assembly line production model of open learning, and this comes from one of the larger providers in Canada that does not employ professorial staff to register, to do course design, to evaluate, and so on, but employs people with MAs to deliver a course that is pre-planned and developed. And they work in isolation from one another. I hesitated about including this slide. There's a book that I wrote with a PhD colleague of mine called Cognitive Capitalism. It's actually an attempt to understand the wider context for these kinds of developments, based on a discourse called cognitive capitalism, which is referred to as the third capitalism after mercantile and industrial capitalism. I think it's an increasingly significant theory which focuses on these socioeconomic changes caused by Web 2 technologies, which have transformed the mode of production and the nature of labour. And at this point, really, I want to talk about the theory of creative labour, of symbolic labour. And it draws, one of the other things, it draws on the French and Italian thinkers, Deleuze, Guattari, Foucault's work on biopower, Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, who wrote the foreword for this book. I may have already turned a lot of you off by mentioning this. I hope not. I hope you give it a little bit of basis. Why I'm attracted to this theory, because it does build on a literature that I'm very familiar with on Foucault, Deleuze, and others. I think it theorises transformation of capital from the viewpoint of labour rather than of capital. It provides a useful vehicle for discussing the role and status of the university in the sociological tradition of post-industrialism. So, and I quote a little bit from here from Hart and Negri. Jobs, for the most part, are highly mobile, involve flexible skills, characterised in general by the central role played by information, knowledge, information, affect, and communication. That was in the year 2000. And, they make good use of the Marxian heritage really drawn on by Antonio Negri. So here, I present it to you as a kind of working hypothesis. This is the P2P Foundation's reading of it. Can I just read this paragraph? Excuse me. I know I'm committing a sin against the epistemology of PowerPoint. Mea culpa. The production of wealth is no longer based on standardised, homogeneous models for the organisation of the labour process, regardless of the types of goods produced. Production in cognitive capital takes place through a wide variety of labour process models, made possible by the development of new technologies of linguistic communication, transportation, and characterised by different forms of networking. Okay, so here's the next issue. Academic, let's say the financialisation of higher education. Financialisation is now also a discourse, a literature that's quite old. This comes from a roundtable of the LA Review of Books. These are the features of the financialisation of higher education. MOOCs are speculative financial instruments. Well, you see, we're looking at 20 to 30 million to get up a platform. They're a financial policy for higher education. They're also a type of marketing. Well, we know that Stanford's leading the charge here, and MIT, but we also have to ask the question about branding in relation to that centre, the metropole periphery relationship. They're expression of Silicon Valley values. And MOOCs are a kind of entertainment media. I think he might be being a little bit harsh on this, but anyway, here's the case for financialisation of higher education. MOOCs and venture capital, increasingly the result of venture capital partnerships and for-profit arrangements among big publishers, universities, and providers of video content. So the question is monetisation. It might be open. Now, at what point does it get monetised? At what point and how does it become monetised? And who pays? And how does this process constitute a form of investment in higher education with returns. So the alternative vision. How am I going for time, Gillian? Okay. So the philosophy, radical openness. This is what I want to suggest in terms of the opening sequence of slides that I provided, an alternative vision. I really want to talk about radical openness, to distinguish it from openness in the way that it's been used in the acronym MOOCs. A complex code word that represents a change of philosophy, ethos, a set of interrelated complex changes that transforms markets, the mode of production and consumption, and also the underlying logic of our institution. So that word is doing a whole lot of heavy theoretical work here, but let me see if I can elaborate it a bit further. Peer philosophies. So I began to explain, I think, historically and philosophically, the importance of peer review, of peer organisations, of research organisations that are based on that peer philosophy. And I think that this kind of openness has been theorised in very different ways by Dewey, Peirce and Wittgenstein in terms of community of inquiry, a set of values and philosophies committed to the ethic of criticism that offers a means for transforming our institutions in the age that Negri has called cognitive capitalism. And I really want to make a plug for the concept of creative labour here, expressive, aesthetic labour, which demands new institutional structures for developing knowledge cultures as flat hierarchies that permit, that enhance, that enable the academic learning exchanges as a basis for reclaiming the publicness of our institutions. AARE has and I think other research institutions, not only in education, have a remarkable job and have played a remarkable job as neither non-state, non-market kinds of organisations that have forged, the kind of public space that is required for that peer governance and peer review. So I try to elaborate these 10 core principles of social media that I think underlie this kind of movement. Let me say user participation, which encourages a kind of collective mass collaboration, mobilises the community, and is a user-generated culture, Collective intelligence, well, the term's been around for quite a long time now. It's being used much more to talk about sharing, modifying user-generated content. Transparency, which I think is an extremely important one here, gets to see use, reuse, augment, validate, critique, evaluate others' contributions. Decentralisation, I think, is a very important one here. From the logic of the one to many, that still characterises much of MOOC's development with minimal student interaction, to many to many, that characterises social media interaction any time, any place, collaboratively, independent of other contributors. P2P community of inquiry, a sociality based on conversations that are relationship and knowledge seeking rather than profit seeking. Personalisation, well, I'll include that in there with a couple of question marks here about individual preferences. I'm a little bit sceptical about that one. I included it, but because I think it is also a form, as I've written, of molecular government, as it's used in personalisation in social welfare services, particularly in places like the UK and so on. Design is politics then, an explicit recognition of the dimension of power in design. Who designs for whom, under what conditions? And the way media sites are designed determines how people will use them, often to a large extent. Emergence and self-organisation, criticism and revisability, and public ownership. Very much unlike industrial media. Social media here, it's very interesting to listen to the ABC, which was a review of Rupert Murdoch's, major media holdings in the UK and the kind of setbacks that it suffered there and how he has come out of it all. But really we're talking about that kind of shift, and Rupert Murdoch understands that the nature of that kind of change as well. So these are resources for socialising the university as a public institution that builds on the concept and notion of public, the public sphere, publics generally, civil society, and a global public space. And I think this re-theorising the social here in terms of social media, we can give a philosophical understanding of production, social production, co-production, co-creation, which is the basis for looking at social or creative labour and the social mind in relation to the Dewey-Wittgenstein configuration that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so the university is a public knowledge institution. Does this make me too much of a naive romantic, looking back on the on historically at the age of the public university? But I think that this discourse needs to begin by understanding its own historical and material conditions of its own future possibility, including threats of the monopolisation of knowledge, privatisation of higher education, together with prospects and promises of forms of openness that promote the organisation of creative or expressive labour and the democratisation of access and knowledge in the age of cognitive capitalism. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for putting us right inside our own lives with some sort of hard jars about our everyday reality, but also provoking us for the context of our own research environment. And as Michael has indicated, he's very happy to answer some questions. We're going very well for time. So somebody like to start?
Luke.
One of them sounds like there is something called cognitive capitalism, and it's democratic. And
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Luke. Can you say that again?
It has potential to be democratic, and open and accessible, and we should consider its possibilities for how, our institutions will be transformed and our ways of producing and operating. But there's another, I'd say, underlying or Deweyan question mark about, the logic of capital is accumulation in scarceness, through selective processes, the different species of capital, where capital, the whole game of capital isn't available to everybody. And I think I heard that critique as well. So I'm trying to sort between the two and wonder if you can comment on that. In other words, if it's going to be a cognitive something that's more expansive and democratic, can you really call it capitalism, or does it need to be called something else, maybe?
Yeah, no, good question. I think there are those two elements in the talk, and I would have to say to start with that what I'm kind of advertising and what I stand for is a view about openness which is based on a strictly non-proprietarian view. So I don't want to look at intellectual products and categorise them as property. So the openness movement really is about liberating that paradigm, which is so essential for third stage capitalism. It's the preoccupation of the World Trade Organization to make sure that people respect copyright. Now, I think that one of the things about openness is that this is a radical non-proprietarian movement, really, with some people, and it's open to interpretation, and you've got the liberal view represented by Yochai Benkler, and you've got some of the computer experts who are on the Creative Commons, who have created Creative Commons as a means of countering, a capitalist understanding and historical appropriation, if you like, of things intellectual, and likening them to the concept of property. So it does revolve around, I think, fundamentally a concept of property, and whether that properly applies to things intellectual. And I think the openness movement, at one level, is radically non-proprietarian. It's talking about sharing. It's also talking about the fact that people engage in that kind of social activity in ways that are not motivated by simply turning a profit. So, but yet at the same time, we have to recognise that these are two discernible ideals, and that there are also 50 shades of grey between the two typifications or characterisations. And there is also, one might say, a whole series of hybrid models going on there where some of the big capitalists are sponsoring, through their philanthropy, particularly in the United States, access to public sites which are genuinely collaborative and sharing. So, reality is a messy thing. And, but I think I begin to at least sort out, at least sort out these two models that are struggling against one another at some level, at some different levels. And then you have the complexity of the communication system itself, which we can understand at least in 3 levels, but if not 4, the level of content, the level of code, the level of infrastructure. And each one of those levels may be controlled and owned, and yet permit some kind of freedom. So, the infrastructure might be owned, and even the code might be owned, but the content is permitted to be free in some sense. And, so good question, but messy reality is my answer.
A bit of a Dorothy Dixer. Could you say a bit more about your Dewey, Peirce and Wittgenstein rationale on openness, please?
Yeah, well, I think that those two philosophers, I say Dewey, Wittgenstein, because I think that they both adhere to a kind of principle, and I'll sum that up in a kind of Twitter remark, a tweet, knowledge and the value of knowledge is rooted in social relations. All right? I think that they would stand for that, and I think that if we go back before Dewey to Peirce and we talk about open model of inquiry, then I think we also see not only in Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein for me is a great turning point because he has a huge influence and he follows many of the preoccupations of Dewey. When they talk about they talk about the concept of certainty in relation to knowledge and uncertainty. They talk about knowledge in relation to social practice. They talk about knowledge, therefore, knowledge as a fundamental aspect of sociality. Now, I say the Dewey-Wittgenstein configuration, but I think that we can, as I remarked, we can read that back onto German idealism, onto, in particular, as Robert Brandom does, an analytic philosopher does, back onto Hegel. And if you can do it to Hegel, then certainly you can do it to Marx, and preferably I would take the Marxian view myself on practice here. Practice as a form of praxis, and Marx is very much influenced by that kind of model, but that's the backward reading, and the forward reading is the reading about practice, the notion of practice, which is followed through by Pierre Bourdieu, his book, The Logic of Practice, when we read the index to that book, we see where does he get his concept of practice from? Well, actually, from Wittgenstein, a fact that's not really often admitted in the Bourdieu literature. He's very influenced by Wittgenstein on that, and and I don't want to go into Wittgenstein's account of rule following and so on. And in some ways, even the phenomenological movement, inaugurated through Heidegger, might also appropriate itself of a concept of practice here. I think that is really an understanding of the community aspect of knowledge, and also its value, rooted in social relations. So, I'd really like to say more about that, but I think it would be boring for a lot of the non-philosophers to hear me reel off a series of names here. But I think it can be read forward also in the work of Bourdieu, of Foucault, of Derrida, of Deleuze. And I'm influenced in this kind of interpretation by the work of Bert Dreyfus, who's now emeritus at Berkeley, who I've had something to do with, and his NHS seminar going back some way was really about trying to disaggregate those different kind of models of practice, which I think really is something that we in philosophy, when we in education, ought to pay some heed to understanding that what took off in education in the 70s with reflective practitioner and the work of Schoen and Argyris, and also in a management context, and then moved to communities of inquiries and situated cognition, and then community of practice and so on, really has this philosophical undergirding. And these people learn very strongly from those philosophers. So, and in some sense, I also see that configuration as a way of understanding the fundamental tensions in the birth of educational research, going back to that caricature that I provided between Dewey and Thorndike. But we need to go into much more detail. I think, I've just got to say, to see more critical work on the critical history of educational research is, it's a field waiting for, the next, the next professor of education, or gifted postgraduate.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for your responses. And on behalf of the association, I trust that both you and Tina have a fabulous week here in this wonderful city. So there is a small local token, I understand, that the locals will probably, and those of us from the eastern states certainly will be kind of lusting over perhaps what is in your bag. So thank you so much for opening, and enjoy the week. Yep.